Hello, time for another Man in Great book review. Today's book is Abortion, a personal story, a political choice by Pauline Harmange, translated from French by Caitlin O'Neill and published in 2023 by Scribe. It's 72 pages. Pauline Harmange is a feminist activist and writer who became famous in France when she wrote a little book called I Hate Men that a government bureaucrat in France tried to have publication stopped on. In France, you can actually prevent, they don't have a First Amendment in France, and a French bureaucrat tried to stop her book from being published, and then, of course, it was published, and the publicity caused it to become a bestseller. Well, this book, or follow-up to that, it tells the story of an abortion she had early in her marriage, and the effects that it had on her psychologically for years afterwards. As the story begins, Harmange is married, but she's in college working on her master's, struggling to finish it up, and struggling really to figure out what she wanted to do with her life in terms of a career. Her husband didn't have a full-time job. He kind of flitted back and forth between various temp jobs, and they were really just barely scraping by financially. She was using birth control. She had an IUD, so she was shocked one day to discover that she was pregnant. She'd had a pregnancy test, came back positive, and so the two of them mutually decided very early on that they weren't ready to have a child. They weren't financially able to raise a child, and they didn't feel themselves psychologically ready, and so they decided to have an abortion. Now, this book is often compared to an earlier book by another French writer, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Anne Ernaux, who wrote a book called Happening, which is about her abortion in the 1960s when abortions were illegal in France. And in that book, Ernaux she's also in college and becomes pregnant accidentally. And she goes to a quack abortionist, and she almost dies from the procedure. She nearly bleeds to death. And she finds out later on that the doctors, her doctor, knew of a safe place to have an abortion, but refused to tell her because he was afraid of being prosecuted. Well, this book is much different because abortions became legal in France in the mid-1970s. In fact, they're actually paid for by the National Health Service of France. However, in France, abortions are only legal for the first 12 weeks. So French law is more restrictive than it is in many states in the United States where abortions are legal. So the issue wasn't really that she couldn't get an abortion. She got one. You'd have to go to a hospital, though. They don't have the kind of clinics that we have in the United States. You have to go to a hospital. Midwives aren't allowed to perform abortions, things like that. So she has an abortion, but then she has mixed feelings about it. Now, she makes it clear in this book, she never regrets her decision. She said it was the right decision at the time, and later on she did have a child when she was more financially stable, and her husband was as well. So she did want children. She just didn't want them at that time. And she never regrets having an abortion, but she does feel guilt and even shame for it, and to the point where there's a really interesting story in the early part of this book where she finds out that one of her friends is pregnant, and it upsets her, and she's not really sure why she's upset about that. And then a few months later, she gets a baby shower invitation, and she's so upset about it that she throws it in the trash and hides it from her husband and doesn't go to the shower. And then a few months later, when the baby arrives, the family, her friend and her husband and the baby all come to visit her, and she's so upset that she feigns illness. She goes upstairs and pretends to be sick so that she can't come downstairs to see the child. And then she thinks about this later on. Why do I feel this way? And she comes to the conclusion that even though abortions are legal in France, there's still a huge social stigma about them. When the law was first passed to make abortions legal, through 12 weeks, there was actually a waiting period for 6 weeks. You couldn't have an abortion for the first 6 weeks because they wanted you to think about it before you actually had one. So so there was a 6-week waiting period. That's been done away with. But she says in this book that there's still a feeling that if you have an abortion, you're somehow a bad person. You're morally inferior to others who've had children, stuff like that. And she says part of the problem is women are discouraged from acknowledging that they've had an abortion or talking openly about it, and that's part of the problem. And so she argues in here that feminists should be able to promote the idea that abortions are not, someone who's had abortion is not morally defective, that an abortion is a decision that should be left up to the individual and they shouldn't be judged for it. And she says that the best way to kind of break out of this kind of guilt imposed cultural guilt is to speak openly about it. So she goes online and asks women to tell their abortion stories to her. She organizes events where people come and speak about having their abortion, and then of course she writes this book. Well, however you feel about the abortion issue, I think this is an important book to read because it's very thought-provoking, and it covers an area that's not often talked about, which is the after effects of abortion, how abortion affects women years, even decades after they have an abortion. What effect does it have on them, and what effect does the overall culture have on them? It's a short book, only about 70 pages. You can read it in one sitting, and it's a very well-written book, and so it's certainly worth reading if you're at all interested in the topic of abortion or feminism in general. The book is Abortion, A Personal Story, A Political Choice. The author is Pauline Harmange. This has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.